visitors becoming producers, as if there were always visitors in the museum and now visitors are becoming producers. I think producers have had, till the end of the 19th century, a very large active role in museum work, in collecting, in founding museums, and then sort of the professionalization of our field came into being, and this is sort of changing, maybe in a sort of third wave. I see parallels there. So I would like to look at the matter more from a sort of inside perspective, so looking into the system museum, but with a focus today not so much on collecting and collecting practices, but more exhibitions and museum and audiences in general, because that's sort of the thing that we are reflecting upon the next 2 weeks. And thinking about our assignment of conducting or giving ideas for a new gallery that needs to be in place 10 to 12 years, I thought you have to be futuristic, because you have to be in some kind of way be aware what is still relevant in 10 years time. And this futuristic aspect is very important in museum work, and maybe not for nothing, especially in these days. The Museum Association, so the British Museum Association, which was the first in the world, and therefore they are the Museum Association, published this year their agenda for the next 20 years to come. And in this agenda, they have written a vision, what they want that museums are and should be for the next 20 years. So they asked experts, and it's all about participation, it's about relevancy via participation. So in that sense, a vision is very strongly in the agenda of the British Museum Association. Look it up, it's on PDF, you can Google it, it's very interesting. And I think good, if we want to tackle a museum gallery for the next 10 to 15 years, to see how the field is thinking about this future in the museum world. Whether or not it will become reality is another aspect of futurology, but anyway, it's interesting to reflect upon. I would like to specifically look at the agenda of the Dutch Museum Association, who also reflected on the next 12 years. How will our field look like? What will be relevant for museums and galleries in the next 13 years? The agenda 2026, it's because in 1926 the Dutch Museum Association was founded. So it's sort of an interesting, I mean, they didn't choose 2026 for nothing. And what you see in this agenda 2026 is that they didn't, in difference to England, ask experts, but they looked at the larger demographics of the Netherlands. And I know the Netherlands and Sweden, they're different things, but still I think there are some common meaners that might be interesting if we look at the Sweden case study for the next several days. Because in this agenda they looked at trends, not museums specifically, but larger in the Dutch cultural and demographic landscape. And they see trends. The baby boom generation retires. So all the people that were born after the Second World War till the beginning of the 60s, they're slowly retiring. They are still very vital, they are very highly educated, and they want to participate. So museums, please be aware of these baby boomers because they are coming your way. Looking at our project, I think it might be interesting not to focus so much on families with their children, but grandparents and their children. Because the grandparents will come. The grandparents are the baby boomers that will come with the boulabou with their grand or son or granddaughter in it. A large growth international cultural tourism, especially people coming from Southeast Asia, China. Do you want to attract tourists? Where will those tourists come from? And futurology in the Netherlands say they come from Southeast Asia, so be aware. Think about it when you think about making new exhibitions and attracting new audiences. There will be less government involvement. Heavy budget cuts in the Netherlands, might be different case in Sweden, but still interesting to reflect upon. Urban development, we are already for a large part living in the cities, and this will only increase. And what does that do for museums in the city and city museums in particular? There will be an even stronger online society. What does that mean for collection? What does that mean for an actual visit or a virtual visit, etc., etc. And an even bigger international dimension. What is Dutch culture in a hybrid post, whatever world? I'm reluctant to say post-colonial, but in the hybrid transnational world as we are in, at least in Western Europe. So although they're not one-to-one compatible to the Swedish case study, it might be interesting if you think about the galleries to look at these agendas. The British one, who is very visionary, this and this and this we need to do as a museum, having a sort of social relevancy, and this looking at the larger demographic Dutch landscape.
Just for demography, I think it's important that since Sweden had a particular history with the Second World War, our baby boomers are already retired because it was during the war that was. So the demography is a bit specific compared to war Europe.
Okay.
That's the only thing I would say. It differs, otherwise
and this baby boom generation in the German and Dutch landscape, and this less government involvement made me rethink this book, and it reflects also the ideas of what Stefan was calling earlier the whole third wave. And the 20th century was shaped by the rise of professionals, but now a new breed of amateurs has emerged, and these amateurs you should get in your museum. You should work with them, you should participate with them. And you don't want to participate with everybody, no, you want to participate with these pro-Ms, these professional amateurs, these serious and committed amateurs and quasi-professionals, those people that have been doing that for their whole professional life, for example. So if you look at this book of Leadbitter and Miller and try to connect it with what is happening in Dutch society, probably also here, it makes the book even more interesting. And thinking about participation with specific groups in society. I come back to this later, but I was a bit confused yesterday because I was thinking about what are we actually talking? Are we talking about giving people access? Are we talking about representation? Are we talking about participation? What kind of participation are we talking about? Are we talking about interactivity? It was very blurry, and I don't think I can give an answer. I only want to give you some of my reflections on it, because I think there's a lot of interconnection, and that's why it's so blurry. Everything is connected to each other. Talking about learning, learning was a thing that was mentioned yesterday by Klaas and Lena yesterday afternoon. We want to attract an audience, and we want them to learn, and we want to be inclusive in that. And learning is, of course, in the museum space of utmost relevancy. And I was not so long ago in maybe the city of learning, of Bildung, this German word that you can't translate, in Weimar. And of course I pilgered to the statue of Goethe and the other guy. If he was a pope. And that's sort of, because we, as Dutch, we sort of don't really grasp the whole concept of Bildung and Bildungsbürgertum, because we don't really have it, and it's not bourgeoisie, it's something else. But everybody was sort of into that, sort of pilgers and takes a picture. So I went there as well, and I took the pictures, and I saw these 4 guys sitting. And I thought, what do they have with this Bildungsbürgerliche idea? What do they have with this idea of Bildung? But how can we integrate them? And should we integrate them? And there the vision comes in. And how can you do that in a museum landscape? So I was very happy in the beginning of September to see those 4 guys. And maybe I'm very mistaken and I'm stereotyping people, but they don't seem to be the sort of Bildungsbürger you used to come across in museum settings. So talking about learning, talking about access, representation and participation, you come of course to our good friend Richard Sandel, who not coined the term, but he was the one that made it, or gave it a face in the museum landscape. And he's now head of museum studies in Leicester. So this whole idea of social inclusion is about access, it's about who has access. And not access because of the space, but also this whole idea of, am I invited to get in? I refer to those guys. Am I represented, and can I participate? And I believe when we talk about participation, we also talk about access. And we also talk about representation. And what is what? It's so overlapping, so it's very strongly, of course, working with the term social inclusion, which is very polluted because it's top-down, political, new labor. It's about how can you make museum objects, or can you use museum objects as a tool to integrate the other. So that's the other side, sort of the dark side of social inclusion. But if we sort of try to get rid of the political context, which I'm very aware of, but just look at the terms, access, representation and participation. How do you do that in a museum space? Because talking about Tuffler, our Richard is also a visionary, is also a messianic person, because he talks about that museums should be agents of social regeneration, that museums should be vehicles of broad social change. And should they? That's of course a question we can pose. So there's a lot of Henry Jenkins in here as well. I think you all know about this idea, at least the Rijnmond students, like, oh no, not social inclusion again. But the idea of social inclusion is sort of going through my whole presentation. Connecting this to learning theory, which I think is not participation, it's accessibility. And maybe therefore, because you create accessibility, people can participate. I would like to reflect a bit on learning theory anyway, because learning theory is all in the exhibition space, and I think it's one of the things that Klaas and Lena asked you to look at. You know David Cole, and you know Bernice McCarthy, those people that work with learning theories. And you have 4 kinds of learners. You have the analytical learner, you have the common sense problem solver learner, you have the dynamic learner and the imaginative learner. And these learning types, these learning styles need to be represented in the museum space, because then you create accessibility in the content and people can participate. That's sort of the idea behind it. So you should have things that people can watch, can think, can do, can sense, can feel. This is something which is very strongly a dominant discourse in the Netherlands and in the UK. And I sometimes say to students, I wish that we didn't need to go to a Kolb museum anymore, because you can open the drawers, you can do things, you can watch, you can feel, you can sense. And it's very strongly, at least in the Netherlands, something from the first part of the new century. Like that maybe in 20 years' time somebody would write a dissertation saying, oh yeah, this is this typical learning styles exhibition we had in the beginning of the 21st century. I'm a bit bored by that. I know it's important, but I think we've come beyond that point. What unfortunately did not happen until now that often is not, what happened is that content was put in frameworks in the exhibition that people could watch, think, do and sense and feel. But what we didn't do so far in museums yet is actually work on content from these learning styles. So what kind of exhibition do you create when from the beginning onwards you take those different learning styles seriously? And Rita Mercury Hofstad did that, and she wrote a very good article about it, and she took the example 8. So if you take these learning styles, which we should do because then we give a lot of people access to the museum, so we do social inclusion. If we don't do it only in the hardware in the museum, but also conceptually, we would, if we take the example 8, would make an exhibition where the medical knowledge would be addressed, because it is something that might be interesting for a person who's very analytical. The common sense problem solver would be interested in the social impact. What does AIDS mean socially? The dynamic person might be interested in coining topics as industry and politics. And the imaginative person, the imaginative learner who seeks emotional and personal meaning, might be interested in personal histories. So it's not the hardware, we've done that. We know how to open drawers now, but please, it might be so interesting to go one step further and to integrate these learning styles into the actual context, content of the exhibition. And it would be a hell of a task to do this for 0 to 12-year-olds and their grandparents, not their mothers and fathers, but their grandparents, but it might be interesting to think about. Okay, so this is participation in a way. We can look at participation, maybe it's more accessibility, but still we could define this as participation. Another thing of participation is, of course, who is being represented. And this is in Croydon, a local community museum in the south of London. where every year they celebrate the Black History Month, which is celebrated throughout Britain in September, October. And there, when it is this month, they put stickers on particular objects that says Croydon celebrates Black history. We could talk about this a lot, whether this stickering is just not pointing out and othering again, but apart from this sort of critical analysis, it's a way of representation. We are aware of these stories, we are aware of the other. This is one form of representation that might be considered participation. Another thing which is very known now in Britain and also here in Sweden, especially downstairs, is the LGBT groups. So lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender and queer. So there should be another letter. And Croydon is very known for their active collecting policy in collecting as heterogeneous as the society is in Croydon. So this is something connected to homosexuality and prostitution. It's a document, and they actively and with the community itself collected these objects, or participatory collecting, and filling gaps in the collection, so representation, and then of course showing it. Yeah.
Can I ask you, do you also know how they collected it with the communities?
They have an active policy of having people, LGBT people, in the staff, and having very good connections to specific communities in Croydon. So they work a lot with key workers. And how they perceive themselves, I come to back later. This participatory collecting is something that I'm very interested in myself. I don't think it will be relevant for us during the next couple of days, but it's interesting if we talk about families, if we talk about diversity. Is every family being represented? Are the two women with their, or the two lesbian grandmothers with their grandson being represented in? Are they spoken to in the exhibition, in the concept of the exhibition? Okay. Now I make a short cut to how I perceive the 20th century from a museological perspective. And I'm not talking about waves, I'm talking about revolutions. And it's important for my argumentation. I see around the 1900s the first museum revolution, the museum modernization movement, where our museum profession was sort of defined. So we, the museum professional, came about. The curator in that concept, and the curator was the professional who, in this whole 20th century, got more and more important, but also others in the museum field got important. People who did education, people who did information management, conservators, etc., etc. So the professionalization of our field started in the 1900s. Leadbeater and Miller said that as well. The 20th century was shaped by professionals. So our professionalization indeed came up at the beginning of the 20th century. Then something happens in the 70s, which we call I call the second museum revolution, where this new museology comes up. Like, why are we doing what we're doing? For whom? Who decides? What is it with the source community? It's of course also the source community and the non-Western world in this whole post-colonial thought and other larger developments that knocked at the museum's doors. Well, 1970s, a long time already ago. I see at the moment a third museum revolution, which I define as a participatory revolution, as a participatory museum since around 2000, where this idea of new museology, where we did work with specific communities, developed and developed and developed further, and where especially this Museum 2.0 idea of user-generated content became more and more important. So this is a sort of radicalization of what already happened in the 1970s. You could argue whether or not these are two different things, but I think they are, and I'm going to explain to you why. So this professional has defined him or herself in the 70s in the Institute Museum, and from the 1970s onwards we are aware that there's an outside world, especially in city museums and museums like this, ethnology museums, because of course in an ethnology museum you are aware and need to be aware of the other. But this other was always defined by the professional. It was the source community where the objects come from, or it was a specific group in the city. Like, for example, in the Netherlands, the Moroccan or Turkish minority of a specific neighborhood in the Netherlands. And the museum decided that they wanted to work with them in the project. And this year it would be this community, and the year after it would be that community. But something happened, I say, at the end of our century, at the end of the last century, and the beginning of the 20th century, because of, not only because, but also because of this whole 2.0 things, people can create their own community. They don't need the museum anymore. Communities are less defined, and when they are defined, they are more defined by themselves as by the museum. And museums are more and more cooperating with other institutions, so therefore it's not museum anymore, but heritage institutions cooperating with heritage communities. A woman from museological thinking that I admire a lot, and most of the people that think about participation come from an education background, and I think it's because they are sort of aware that they need to be in touch with their audiences. So look her up, great person, and she says this whole idea of working with communities and sharing authority is not 2.0, is 3.0. So she says taking this 2.0 idea into the museum context makes it Museum 3.0. And she talks about a specific 3.0 mindset. And a 3.0 mindset as a museum professional is you are prepared to let go. You take risks. You give people permission to go for it, then learn from that. So it's a constant process. Encourages connections and networks. So we are in a network with others, in relationship with others. Provide scaffolding and support that others can work from. We don't always need to. Innovate ourselves. Others can use our material and do it instead. It's also, of course, letting go. Talking about authority and who's the expert. Acknowledges that a healthy community will self-monitor and self-correct, which I think is interesting. And remembers that some areas will still need discipline and maybe also censorship and organizational input. So it's not 100% letting go. That might be also naive in the system which is called the museum. but we need many more participation. I like this, but I don't agree that it's Museum 3.0. I think this is Museum 2.0, but I don't want to talk about semantics. But I put Museum 3.0 in my context, especially after our talk with the conservator curator yesterday afternoon in the depot, because I think we are now evolving in a 3.0 stage. And the 3.0 stage is the semantic web. So everything is connected to each other. All the data in the web are connected to each other. Heritage institutions are connected to each other. Their collections are connected to each other. And people can give value to this collection online. That is Wikipedization the lady talked about yesterday afternoon, at least in the ideal form. The semantic web, Nova Spivak already wrote about that in 2007. And what does that mean for us as museum professionals in a museum context? It means, I think, that we are now confronting with two things, Museum 2.0 and Museum 3.0. We are and will be in the Museum 2.0, so we will work with user-generated content. We will work in the framework of participation, and we will work with free choice communities. So it's not that we decide as a museum with which community that we want to work with. No, the communities create their own hub. So it's all about participatory culture. And this free choice community is different from the 70s. But we are also in a 3.0 phase because of this networked online culture. It will even increase our culture and society more and more. Look at the Agenda 2026 of the Dutch Museum Association. So now it's not only about user-generated content, but it's also about connected content. Connecting this user generation to the larger content, also of different heritage institutions. It's about participation, but this participation becomes personalized even more and more. And these free choice communities can be seen in this heritage community context, which I won't go in further. So participatory culture in a networked society. But what does that mean for us as museum professionals? People that are already in the museum setting or want to work in a museum setting. The professional 2.0 is, I think, a mixture between a curator and an educator. The people in Croydon see themselves as liaison officers, to go back to the question of Danielle. How do you get your audience? You are having liaisons, you are having relationships with people in the community that you work with. And you are a facilitator and a mediator with these communities. So the curator, educator as a term is being used more and more. This will stay and will even increase, but something else will develop more and more. And that's why I was so happy that our lady of this yesterday afternoon was talking about this information management system, because if everything is connected to everything and if all the content can be put in the collection systems and in the internet and all the systems are connected, then this facilitator will stay, but he or she also will need to be an information manager, because somebody needs to give meaning to this semantic web, to this enormous amount of information. Because you're not only, as a museum professional, in the future connect people with each other and give meaning to these different voices, but you also are the one that connects people to the data and therefore create heritage. So I see a renaissance of the information manager, which might perceive in your context maybe as a very dull back office sort of profession, but I think it will be very, very important. And also inflicts the way you work with your exhibitions. So the whole blurring between back office and front office will it will blur. You have a question?
How do you divide the information manager from the scientist?
It can be the scientist, but it's the one who can also work with information systems.
I'd like to give a
Yeah.
Can we say that if we go back to the presentation, that the natural officers can be prosumers? It would be wrong to say that.
Huh? What?
There. Can we be able to say that the natural officers,
Yeah.
in the first presentation, can they be also termed as prosumers, as she mentioned in the first presentation, or I'd be wrong to say that?
They can be,
Prosumers or
but they also can establish contact.
yes.
Context to the prosumers.
Prosumers would be those in the communities who are actually making, content for themselves, but need a mediator or a liaison officer that then says, "Oh, this is interesting. Let's put this into the museum."
I help you.
I help you to your production for self-use, to broaden it up for production for exchange in the museum. I would say that's an interesting thought.
But it can be the prosumer. If you are skilled, if you've done it 5 times, you are the facilitator or mediator yourself.
Yeah. This is why
if you've done 5 IKEA kitchens, you
this is why
you can do the 6th.
deprofessionalization is real.
Yeah, precisely. This connecting people and data, you need expert knowledge, because you are the one connecting everything. You are the one that gives sense to the enormous vast amount of information. So my question mark is, are we in the near future will see a renaissance of the expert? And will it be the end of participation? Because we need to have people who can give meaning and value to the whole data, which are produced participatory. I don't know. It's interesting. I'm curious. What I do know is that in especially the art world, art museums, there's another development in professional self-definition, and I sent you an article to read from this book, Cultures of the Curatorial. It was this interview with Irit Rokov, where she talks about curatorial practices, where she says it's all about network and it's about process. And do we as curators focus still on the outcome, or are we more interested in the process? And what she says, Irit Rokov, in the interview is actually that she says, I am myself more interested in the process, but you have a deadline. And that's what you have as well. I mean, we are maybe more interested in the process during this next 11 days, or what do we have? I don't know, 8 or something. But we have a deadline to present on the 11th of October. So there is again the difference between theory and vision and actual practice in the museum world, since it's a system where you have rules and project managers with deadlines and stuff. Another thing which is not in the article I sent you but in the book is that they say the curator expert knowledge is less and less important because it's something that is everywhere, and there are people that are more expert than you, and you in this Wikipedization world can have very strong and good access to this knowledge, but it's about giving a viewpoint to this knowledge, giving your sort of defined ideas or statements about it. So maybe in one article it says the curator is becoming a journalist. It's becoming an essayist who writes not a 3-page article in the Groene Amsterdammer in the Dutch context or Die Zeit in Germany, but makes an exhibition. So that the curator is becoming more and more a person with a face who has a kind of, that you know, I'm going to an exhibition of Leontine and I sort of know what she will be saying. And I'm interested in her views on the world. So the curator becoming a journalist, having their, how do you say that, their tentacles in society, participate in this society and reflect upon it. So here in the book it says, where is then the identity of the artist and where's the identity of the curator, especially when it comes to modern art. So are we now working as artist curator, because as a curator you're actually an artist yourself as well. Highly interesting. I'm not sure where it will go to, but I know that there's one, not a museum, but one exhibition initiative that I very much like, and they work as a kind of journalist. It's in Germany, it's in Switzerland at the Stapferhaus. They don't have a collection, so it's easy for them to work in the contemporary society as kind of journalists, and they reflect upon contemporary issues in these exhibitions. And now it's about modernity and all the decisions and possibilities we have as postmodern people. Highly interesting and highly, I don't know which of you from the German context have already visited the Stapferhaus once, but I think they are working as a curator in a sort of journalist mode, where you already can sort of see, aha, this is a Stapferhaus exhibition. These are those people, I know them, as you know by feuilleton writers in the papers. There's also a lot of criticism towards participatory work and culture, and I like this Marcus Miesen a lot. He's young, he's dynamic, and he actually is very critical towards this concept of participation. And he says, well, you read it in the articles I sent to you, or the interviews. If everybody can participate, what is expert knowledge? And it's all about finding a consensus, and that's not what we want. And being a curator is having a sort of statement, and being in a museum space should give you an opportunity to, as a curator, to work with contested ideas, to criticize, to reflect, and this is not possible in this participatory mode. And there, I say, I totally do not agree, dear Marcus. For me, participation can be this heterotopia, and can be this museum as contact zone, where different opinions can conflict. So what I perceive as the power of participation, namely the contact zone, is something that Marcus Miesen says, because of participation we can't have that. So we're totally opposite, although I think we would agree very much. He just defines participation different than I do. And I hope museums and also our 0 to 12-year-old space can be something like this, where contested views can be argued and can be reflected upon. So and that's also, of course, my teaching ethics. I'm very interested in this and how the museum space can provide such atmospheres and you also read an article by Short that he says, yeah, in theory that's interesting, but how do you do this in practice? So that's the good point. By coming from theory, you can sort of playfully think about things and you don't need to put it in practice. So that's why I was very, very, very interested in museum public perception and attitudes to the purpose of museums in society, again from the Museum Association that came out in spring, because here they asked, what do you think about this participatory museum, and what do you think as the public about this space where contested things can be argued. So I was very eager to find out. Okay, I read it. And museums hold a unique position of being trusted. Members of the public see museums as the guardians of factual information and as presenting all sides of the story. Okay. I don't know if I agree with that we do this, but okay, it's interesting. Presenting all sides of the story can be this third space contact zone kind of provide this opening. But then I read this. Participants consistently agreed that museums were not appropriate environments in which to hold controversial debates. Whoa! Then I drank vodka. Because this of course goes into everything I've just said before. That the public doesn't want that. So we can visionary say, people, you need to participate in this contact zone because it makes you a better person. But they don't want that. And that's why I was so enormously intrigued by the dissertation that Michelle wrote and graduated in summer, because she did a very interesting research about a participatory project in the Netherlands, and she interviewed the people who participated 5 years after. And what did they actually learn, think, and reflect upon 5 years on this process? And that's why I want to give the last couple of minutes to Michelle and give her a big applause. Woo. And I asked Michelle because she can maybe shine her light on this.
This is
speak up.
Yeah. This is a question from the project, one of the projects. For my thesis last year, I've been compared for 4 different participation projects in city museums. The projects are very different from each other, but they also had things in common. All museums were looking for contemporary objects and stories from ordinary people. They each did it on our own way. One of the projects that is really close to me is the project in Zoetermeer, Stadsmuseum Zoetermeer. 5 years ago, the museum started with the project Give and Take. This project entailed asking the inhabitants of Zoetermeer to bring an own object to that then to represent this town they live in. Zoetermeer is a new town, which means that many people don't originally come from Zoetermeer, but have their roots somewhere else. For example, I have lived with my family in Zoetermeer for 18 years now, but actually feel that my roots are in The Hague, where I was born. We were asked to participate in the project from Give and Take in the museum. However, providing them with an object proved to be difficult. My mother's response to the question was, Zoetermeer doesn't feel like home, it's just a place to live. A lot of other people who were asked to participate in the project respond in the same way. Out of the open call that was made by the museum to more than 100,000 inhabitants in Zoetermeer, only 86 objects with stories were collected. The museum chose to relinquish the control of the presentation of the project. There was no curatorial involvement at all. The objects and stories were presented actually the way the participant handed them. As part of the project and from give and take, the participants didn't not only give an object to the museum, they were also allowed to take something, a design bottle of water or champagne. This was intended as an incentive. All objects there was brought became part of the museum collection, called Collection 2008. After the give and take session, the second part of the project started, which was titled in Dutch wisselwerking. It means interaction. Here the participants work together with professionals from different disciplines. The participants worked as a curator and walked through the whole process of visualization and maintained full authority. This all took place 5 years ago. For my research project last year, I conducted several interviews and extensive surveys. It was a retrospective, the event of the project participant point of view. How did the participants look back on the project? What had they learned? Why were they motivated to bring something in museums? And what did they take away for themselves from the project? I also interviewed some of the staff members of the museum and asked them to reflect upon the project as well. Some of the comments and conclusions of my research project were, looking back, the people felt very positive about the project and closer connected with the city of Zoetermeer. In addition, the participants reconnected over the shared experience of the project, which resulted in a very good memory. Because the museum during the Give and Take project prevented itself from any authority, the objects in the exhibitions and the accompanying stories varied in quality substantially. For a number of participants, this was unsatisfying, and they felt that the museum should have set some criteria with respect to the quality of the objects that were allowed to be included in the exhibition. Several respondents state they felt that for a lot of participants, the fact that they would get a bottle of champagne or water was the main reason to supply an object for the exhibition. In short, the director of the museum, Meijer-van concluded about the project. Involving public in the museum provides to be difficult. To cite her, you want to involve the entire city, and eventually only 50 people come. It also turned out to be a challenge to realize an exhibition that is not only interesting for the participants, but also for the visitors. Also, the participants of the project felt their contribution were relevant and meaningful. Regular visitors didn't grasp the intention of the exhibition. For example, one of the visitors responded, "Why should I be interested in the lamp of Muhammad sitting on a plane with an IKEA shelf?"
I'm sorry that we sort of overdid the time, but I think questions we can maybe do during lunch, right?
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Michelle.